This is The Data Slice, hosted by the Data Science Alliance. It's where we sit down to talk all things data science, AI, and tech, any way you slice it. I'm Callan Hodman, and joining us today is Elaine Harwell. She is a partner and privacy officer at Procopio, and she's here to tell us all about privacy, personal information, things to look out for, how we can protect ourselves, in the digital world. It's so important these days. So really excited to have you on our podcast and talk all about your expertise in that field. But first off, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much. Yeah, fabulous to be here.
We're excited to have you. This is an interesting topic and a really important one. So appreciate you coming on and just telling us everything, got to pick your brain here. But I was thinking for people who might not know you, to get started, could you first just tell us, a little more about you, about your background, what led you to the career path that you're on now?
Sure, yeah. I am a partner at a law firm right now, and my background has always been in litigation. So since I started my career, I've always done business and commercial litigation. And probably about 12 years ago or so, I handled some consumer class action cases that had some privacy issues mixed up in it. And I really just kind of thought it was the most interesting thing that I had seen in the law and decided that I wanted to turn my practice that direction. So I started learning everything that I could about privacy. It was very in its early stages back then. So what I found to be interesting was that the judges didn't know what to do with it. The lawyers didn't know what to do with these privacy issues. And I just found that to be fascinating. The law really had not developed yet a lot at that point in time. So it was something that to me was very interesting. And I think that as lawyers, sometimes you have to be comfortable with living in the gray. And this is very much the gray. So it's an area that has developed quite a bit. Got into privacy. Now I do privacy counseling for companies. I still do a lot of litigation. So a lot of my litigation tracks along privacy issues, but not always. And I am now wrapped up in dealing with new privacy laws that have developed in California and in the rest of the United States and frankly, the rest of the world. So it's a exciting field. It's super fun to be in, always changing. I get to work with clients who are doing very cutting edge things, working on new technologies, advising them on use of personal data, a lot of times consumer data, which has become the new gold, I think, in terms of its use and being able to learn about people, what they like, their preferences, to be able to market to them, sell products to them, whatever it is. So it's a really interesting area right now.
What has it been like for you, over the years to see, like you said, things have changed and grown. There are new laws out there. So what has it been like throughout your career to watch kind of that field, the industry really shape and grow?
Yeah, it's been, I think, a lot of conversations about what we as a society want to think about in terms of data use, right? I think a lot of times, and this was probably something that most people didn't understand really, is that their data was being used to understand them better, to be able to market to them, do lots of different things. But thanks to some big tech companies that had a few missteps in this space, it really kind of came to the forefront. And now consumers are paying a lot more attention to what's going on with their data. And as consumers pay attention, so do regulators. So that's really where we've seen a big development. We've seen a lot of regulators here in the United States and elsewhere as well to really take up the cause of protecting consumer data. It's very easy to get behind protection of consumer data, both as a regulator and as a legislator. It's an issue I think that a lot of consumers have been complaining about. They've not started noticing that ads track them around the internet, show up on various devices, and they're wondering how that is. So there's been a lot of development and learning, I think, by both the consumer on the consumer front and also on the regulator and legislative front, which has really led to the development of more laws in this space. And as more laws come around, then the companies have to pay attention to their compliance obligations around that. And they have to make sure that they are safeguarding personal data in the ways that the legislature expects them to and the laws expect them to. And it's a developing field. So sometimes there's a lot of question and ambiguity around, can I do this? What can I do with this data? How can I use it? Can I share it? Can I sell it? Can I profit off of it as a company? So lots of those types of questions that I think that we're really grappling with right now. And I think as we continue to have more of these conversations in society and within our community, that'll sort of start to flush out a little bit. And I think we'll get to a place where we as a society are comfortable with the way that companies can use data, the way that governments can use our data. And I think, there's room for a lot of change still, and room for a lot of learning, I think, for companies as well too.
Kind of getting everyone on the same page a little bit. Like you said, I think we've all been there where we have a conversation about something and then maybe the next day get an ad for that thing on Facebook or something like that. And
Yeah.
it can be an interesting feeling, of feeling so targeted, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little frightening, I think, to most people, and they don't understand why that's happening.
Mm.
But, as I think, like I said before, we start to learn as a community and as a society about how our data is being used. Then you start to realize, oh, wait, my phone has privacy settings. Like, how do I make changes to those privacy settings? And I think, there's kind of a conventional wisdom is that younger people with phones tend to have a better idea of how to work those privacy settings rather than older folks using them. I don't know if that's so true now. I think there's a lot of people that are starting to understand how to use the privacy settings on their phone, on their devices, on whatever it is.
Mhm.
And that is a way to make sure that you have some control over your data, which is essentially what the laws are trying to do in privacy is give consumers a little bit more control over their data.
Yeah, definitely. How would you kind of when we come to official terms, how exactly would you define privacy? Or is there a certain way that you define privacy when it comes to the work that you do?
So that's a really good question. And I think it just depends upon what you're doing and how you're looking at it. Privacy at its core is really the right to be left alone, right? Free from interference, and whether that be from government, whether that be from companies, whether that be from other family members. It's really something that is intended to allow you, I think, to have now a little bit more control over your data. So it's the ability to say to a company, hey, I don't want you to use my data in that way. Or, you have used the data now sufficiently and I would like you to delete it. There's no need for you to have that data. So having that ability to control that data. And that's really something that is relatively new here in the United States and even abroad. In the US, California was the first state to have a comprehensive privacy law that really governed over all companies and industry. It didn't make a difference as to what industry you're in. Here in the US, in the past, we've always kind of done it by sector. So if you are talking about healthcare data, then it may be governed by HIPAA. If you're talking about financial information, it may be governed by other federal laws. But there's never been in the US a comprehensive privacy law that covers no matter what industry you're in. So California was really the first to do that in 2018. And the law itself doesn't apply to every company. So it's really meant to be a law that covers slightly larger companies because we have a startup culture here in California that I think the legislators really wanted to protect. So you have to be of a certain size to be subject to these laws. But really, when I counsel my clients, I talk to them a lot about kind of the direction that the law is headed and the expectation of, well, even if this doesn't apply to you right now, for example, nonprofits are not covered by the law,
Hmm.
but it is a best practice that has developed. And now, when companies are thinking about how to use data, we're often talking about if you're not subject to the law right now, what are those best practices? What should you be doing to protect the data? How should you be treating the data? And I think it's a good conversation to have. I think that companies who are thinking about that are putting themselves in a good position. I think, a lot of companies now see a competitive advantage when they are using data safely and they're able to communicate that to their consumers or customers. And I think consumers pick up on that and they see that and they decide whether or not they want to engage with certain companies on that basis. Um, so so yeah, I think it's an area that we'll continue to see develop and we'll continue to see how the regulators treat companies who may be doing things that they don't like.
Hmm. I know you said California is a kind of a leader in a way with that law. Could you tell us a little more about what that 2018 law was and still is?
Sure, yeah. So the law that was passed is called the California Consumer Privacy Act. We call it the CCPA. It went into effect in 2020. And then actually, we as California voters went to the polls in November of that year and voted to amend that law. So California Privacy Rights Act was then came about, which really just amended the CCPA. And what it did was really create obligations for companies in terms of protecting data And it gave consumers rights over their data. So the right to know what data is being held by a company, the right to ask for data to be deleted if it's no longer needed, or if there's no legal or real good reason, business reason for the company to have the data anymore. It now also allows consumers to ask for their data to be corrected. So if a company has incorrect information about you and maybe they're making decisions about you based on that incorrect data, you now have the right to go to that company and say, hey, can you please correct this for me on my behalf? And the company can verify that and make sure, yes, the information is accurate. But then if it is, they have an obligation to update that information. So, the CCPA, it was definitely first of its kind here in the US. We've now seen 19 other states follow suit. So 19 other states have similar comprehensive privacy laws on the books. We don't yet have a federal privacy law yet. It's been difficult to get things done in Congress, and we'll see what happens with the next administration, but I wouldn't hold my breath there. So right now, the states are taking the lead with respect to protection of consumer rights and data privacy rights. And that's what we've seen. So I think we'll continue to see that trend, which again is why we talk about often with companies the direction that the law is headed, the best practices around that, making sure you're properly securing the data as well too is a requirement under the law. That's something that we don't always talk about in privacy, but really in order to have privacy, you have to have security as well too, and vice versa. So, the more sensitive the data is, the more protections that you need to have around it, right? Which makes sense. If you have very sensitive data, you want to protect it in ways that you wouldn't necessarily have to if the data is more commonly found or publicly available.
Makes sense. Kind of speaking of, I know personal information is a big part of data privacy oftentimes. Could you talk a little more about how we define personal information and how that kind of ties into data privacy?
Yeah, so personal information is actually defined very, very broadly under the laws. I think most people probably don't think of certain things like IP address of a computer to be personal information, but it can be. The way that we define it under the laws here in the United States and with respect to the CCPA and others is really any information that can be reasonably identifying or identified to an individual. So basically, any combination of data. So that could be something like your name and social security number. It could be identifying marks about you. So if you have a very unique tattoo, that could be personal information about you, right? Because you might be able to identify the individual just by that. So it really can comprehend or really can encompass almost anything in terms of different types of data that can be then used to identify somebody. So we're also talking things like insurance policy numbers, aside from social security numbers and driver's license and any government IDs, we might also be talking about information associated with you about your race or ethnicity, in addition to maybe your name. And all of that is going to be considered personal information.
Mm.
So really anything that can identify an individual can be considered personal information of the law. So we have to think of it very, very broadly.
It's a really interesting point. I think some people probably find obvious, like you said, like social security or something like that. But I don't know if people do think about things like a tattoo that is very identifying, though. So that's such a great point. I know you mentioned there are also things happening on a global scale. For example, there is GDPR. Could you talk a little more about that and just kind of what we're overall seeing beyond California or even the US?
Yeah. So, beyond California and the US, I think the GDPR is definitely, that's what's the law that's happening in Europe. It was actually in place earlier than any US based privacy laws, comprehensive privacy laws. So it's kind of considered the leader in the global space. It is the gold standard when we think about data protection. It's a pretty extensive piece of legislation. And in terms of who it applies to, generally privacy laws will apply based on where the individual is located. So if you are here in California, most likely the CCPA or California laws are going to apply to you in terms of privacy. If you are living in Europe, if you're in Germany, then the GDPR will apply to you. So if you're a US based company and you're collecting data worldwide, you may have to consider privacy laws globally as well too. So if you're collecting data from Europe and transferring that data over here to the US to process it or to store it, you may have obligations with respect to that data in terms of making sure it's properly protected. The expectation is that if there's data that's being collected by a company they protect it in the way that they're supposed to be doing and supposed to be protecting it under the laws in that jurisdiction. So it can get really, really complicated for large global companies who have to comply with laws all across the globe. They do differ from country to country and even state to state here in the US. So sometimes keeping up with that patchwork of laws can be a challenge for companies. The compliance obligations can be quite difficult. But that's something that I think a lot of companies have had some time to think about now and to figure out how they want to approach their global privacy programs. And it's a really, interesting issue because sometimes, what may be required in one country or one jurisdiction may be different in another, and then you have to make a decision about how you're going to treat the data. So it can get quite complicated.
Mm. Lots to keep track of, it seems like, especially in your role. Have you ever experienced that, with the work that you do, where you kind of have to analyze or keep track of all these different regulations and things going on?
Yeah, I think in privacy, as a lawyer advising in this space, you definitely have to keep on top of what's happening. I often tell people that I usually spend the first 20 minutes at least of my day just seeing what's happened overnight in the global privacy arena. It is always changing very quickly. So it is one of those things. But as a person that is in privacy law, I find that very interesting. So I want to know what's happened, and I try to make it my job to understand what's happening on a global level with regard to privacy regulations and laws. And then that's what I, sort of bring to my clients in terms of having an understanding of what is happening, the way that regulators and, kind of lawmakers are thinking about the law and privacy. And helping them adopt what they want to do and help them reach their goals, right? Because oftentimes my clients will come to me with an issue with respect to, we have something that we want to do. How can we do that? How can we go about doing that? How can we, meet our goal or reach our goal as a company to, whatever it is that they're either a new product that they're rolling out or a service that they're trying to provide to customers. And they want to make sure that they try to stay within the laws and what's going on. There often isn't always an easy answer to that. So, having a pulse on the way that regulators are thinking about data use, I think is something that I try to do and to make sure that so that I can guide my clients and say to them, maybe there's not an easy answer or a clear answer under the law right now, but this is a way to think about it. So that's kind of what I try to do with my clients.
I know you mentioned earlier there are settings on phones people don't know about or steps people can take. So just kind of overall, are there things that you recommend looking out for or steps to take to kind of on a more personal, singular, individual level, steps we can take to protect our data and our privacy and personal information?
Yeah. So I always, I know probably I'm probably one of the only people, actually myself and other privacy lawyers are probably only people that actually read privacy policies. But if you
Probably.
want to get an understanding of how a company is going to use your data, you can always look to their privacy policy. And if they are complying with laws, then they are telling you what data they're collecting about you, how they're using that data, who they're sharing it with, how long they're going to keep that data. And you can make decisions about whether or not you think that that company is responsibly handling your data. There's always a few kind of key factors and things that I look for when I'm looking at whether or not I want to engage with a company. But certainly privacy settings are one of those things, right? The ability to have control over your data. So if you, encounter a company or an app or something like that, and there's no way to control how you're using that data, and you think about what type of data they might be using, for example, do they need your location in order to provide you with that service? So if they are, and I think, a classic example that comes up quite often in this space is with respect to a flashlight app, right? So for a flashlight app to work, they don't need your location. So if they're asking to collect your location, you may think about whether or not you want to share that data with that company and allow them to use it. Because if they're gathering that information, they don't need it to provide the service for you. For example, a Maps app or something that might need your location in order for it to work properly. Then you may want to think about those controls over that data and declining to share that type of data. A lot of now times you get pop-ups or prompts to be able to make decisions about what you want to do. And you've probably seen that if you
Mhm.
surf the internet at all and you visit websites, you probably see cookie pop-ups come up as well too that ask you, do you want to accept all of our cookies or not? Having an understanding of what's actually happening there is always a good thing, I think. Those types of cookie pop-ups, there are ad trackers, there are cookies, there are pixels that will follow you on the internet. They pay attention to what you're doing. They can share that data. They cannot share that data. If you have cookies set, if you have advertising cookies set and you allow them, then you can expect to see advertising that might be more tailored to some of the things that you're looking at and surfing on the internet for. Just doing a little bit of review to see, what data is being collected about you and how it's being shared, I think goes a long way to protecting privacy.
Yeah. I feel like that's a good point of just taking the moment, because especially with the cookie pop-ups on websites, they pop up so quick. And I feel like it's so easy to just be like, oh, exit, accept, ignore, whatever. But then we don't actually know what we're clicking sometimes. So that's such a great point. Same with photo access or anything like that. Is there anything specific in terms of social media that you've really seen or think people should keep an eye out? Because I feel like that's another one that people just kind of get on there and don't necessarily think about that type of thing.
Yeah, I think with the social media explosion came along with it an explosion of sharing information about ourselves online. It can be dangerous to do that. Probably it's more well known now, I think, but sharing information on your social media feeds about where you are, what, vacation you're taking gives information to people who may be looking for opportunities to take advantage of a situation, right? So if they know you're on vacation, they might know that your house is empty. It may become a target. If you're sharing information about your kids, your family, the more information that you share about yourself online, the more data points can be gathered, the more that's known about you, then the better opportunities for somebody to social engineer you, right? Or to concoct some type of story that's really convincing because they have a way to make it so real to you, right? Because they know so much information about you. So that's kind of one of the things I think that's really happened and developed recently, and especially with AI now, the ability to trick people with good stories, very convincing stories, has gotten much better. One, because there's so much information out there about us. Two, using something like artificial intelligence will help make it more convincing to people, right? I think gone are the days of the Nigerian prince. Now things, looking for just mistakes in emails where there's grammatical mistakes in order to identify a phishing email. Sometimes there aren't any of those errors and you have to be a lot more vigilant. So I think always kind of questioning what's coming into you. If someone's asking you to turn over personal information, you have to ask those questions of why do they need this information? Why are they asking it from me? Who are they? Before turning over anything sensitive, especially sensitive information. You should guard that much more vigorously than other types of information for sure.
Yeah. I know you mentioned typos, and like you said, that used to be kind of a classic sign, but sometimes that's not a sign anymore. Are there specific things that you recommend or that maybe you see people deal with a lot that are some good things to look out for when it comes to kind of scams?
Yeah, I think in my context, I'm often seeing a lot of times people getting tricked under like business email compromises is what they call them. So an email comes to you and maybe it's asking you for specific information, or it's asking you to click a link, or it's asking you to do something in particular that might expose some information. So, click on this link and enter your password because your password has expired. And in order to keep using Microsoft products, you're going to have to put in your password. Anytime you see anything like that, there's always a concern around whether or not it's legitimate, right? So I think a lot of times, there's certain times that people in companies will get targeted because of their roles. They may be dealing with the accounting department. They may be someone who has a lot of authority to be able to send out wire transfers, right? So things like that. And hopefully, if you're in those positions, you're receiving training about that, and just understanding what the latest scams are in terms of trying to trick people. But again, it's that aspect of having a lot of information out there about us on the internet. Sort of those bad actors gathering that information and using it against us to gain our trust, and to get us to do things like click on links or provide certain personal information that might allow access to accounts or to other things like that. So yeah, so there's I think a lot of things that people can do to protect themselves, but the first one I think is always, asking the question of why is somebody asking me for my personal information and do they really need it?
Going back to regulations surrounding all of this, for example, you mentioned how in California nonprofits aren't falling under the law as of right now. Are there changes that you think are expecting to see or might see or are likely to see as the talks around this continue to grow?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be changes in privacy laws. And there already are when we think about the comprehensive privacy laws across the US, right? So I did say that in California, nonprofits are not subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act, but they are included in other state privacy laws that exist as well, too. So if you're a nonprofit that's operating outside of California, you may have privacy laws that you're subject to. And I think that's
Mhm.
something that's pretty new to most nonprofits, pretty new to most companies in general. But as far as changes go, I think we'll definitely see an increase in consumer protection laws and more regulators and legislators paying attention to it. I think as more consumers learn about how their data is being used, there is this awakening or this recognition all of a sudden that, hey, they may not want that to happen, right? Like there's a lot of changes in the law. For example, the fall of Roe v. Wade a couple of years ago really, I think, turned a lot of people's attention to how location data was being used and the
Mhm.
realization that there was this entire industry of data brokers who had been selling location data to various different buyers, including the government, for a very long time. So, when that came to light and the realization that, hey, where you visit during the day may tell a lot about you as a person, right? The healthcare professionals that you visit every day, the places that you go, in terms of your work every single day, your location of your home, all of those things, I think, these patterns that we move about the day with a phone in our pockets all day long really create a lot of, a lot of more information about us that's being gathered, sold, collected, shared by companies all over the place. And so I think, as consumers come to the understanding of how their data is going to be used and start complaining to regulators or to legislators about that data use, we'll probably start to see more of those changes coming about. Here in California, we are unique in that we're the only state that has a regulator entirely dedicated to consumer privacy. So we have the California Privacy Protection Agency, lots of acronyms, CPPA, and they've been very active over the past couple of years. They have ramped up enforcement. They have um, uh, propound or published regulations that are meant to help companies interpret the law. But if you look at them, they're pretty substantive, and there's a lot of prescriptive requirements within these regulations. So, as a company, I think you have to be paying attention to these things, and it tells you how the regulators are expecting companies to use information. With the explosion of AI and automated decision making technology, that's a new set of regulations that has recently come out, and it is extensive. The requirements, if you are going to be using AI technologies to be able to make decisions about people, especially ones that are impactful, that might, for example, impact your ability to get housing or to get an insurance policy, or decisions about your employment. All of those things are very impactful on consumers and employees. And as a company, if you're going to be using those types of technologies, which we all are. We're all trying to adopt these technologies so we don't fall behind in the AI race. There are a lot of requirements that are coming down the pipeline. And I think that's probably we're going to see where the biggest changes are
Mhm.
that are coming down the pipeline. Because, technology tends to move very quickly. Right now, the regulations are really trying to keep up with that. So paying attention to, I think, the adoption of those types of technologies, how they are impacting consumers, right? Is there bias in the technology? Are they able to make decisions without human oversight? Even with human oversight, is that going to be enough? Those kinds of questions, I think we'll start to see a lot more regulation in that space. The US is definitely racing to try to be a leader in the AI space in terms of regulation, and so is California. So I think we'll see the adoption of regulations that will govern how companies can use those types of technologies, probably published and in effect within the next year, and then potentially enforceable a little while after that. So I think lots to pay attention to in this space. I mean, we could talk for days about this kind of stuff,
Yeah,
probably.
totally. This should be like a 5-part series on our podcast or something. Well, within all of that, is there anything that you are especially optimistic or excited about?
I'm always excited about what's happening in privacy. I think, from my perspective, I mentioned before, I just get to work with really great companies doing really great things. So I feel like I have kind of a front row seat to, how technology is being adopted and used by companies right now.
Yeah.
And it's really exciting. It's sort of thinking about the future all the time and thinking about, how and the way things can be used. And we think about, especially here, I think at DSA, the use of big data and how that's really changed a lot of things. The ability to be able to, come up with new cures, or the ability to learn something about a population because you have gathered a tremendous amount of data, hopefully aggregated and de-identified. But the ability to gain insight from large amounts of data is really just unbelievable to me. And I think it's going to lead to a lot of advances in the world. So I think that we should be trying to harness that ability and that power, but doing it in a responsible way, doing it in a way that we make sure we aren't harming our consumers and individuals along the way, or causing them difficulties that they might not otherwise experience. So doing those things responsibly, I think is a really important challenge that I think a lot of companies are facing right now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, like you said, there's so much to keep track of. We could talk forever about this. So I bet we'll bring it back on the podcast soon. Thank you so much for coming on today. I know you've been a great friend to Data Science Alliance, the nonprofit that hosts this podcast. So thanks for letting us bring you on our podcast as well. I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about the next law or the next trend that comes. But for now, we really appreciate your time. This was really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and share it with a friend. Plus, don't forget that Data Science Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we would really appreciate your support. You can make a donation, become a member, volunteer with us, or attend our events. We have lots going on all the time here at our location in San Diego, California. But even if you're not in San Diego, you can get involved. So go to our website, datasciencealliance.org, to get started. Otherwise, we'll see you here next time on The Data Slice.